Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of Payments Corner on Fraud Boxer. I of course have Jacqueline with me here, but we have a special guest. We have Klaus Beck back. How are you doing?
Great. It's good to be back so quickly.
Yeah, we sparked a lot of ideas coming off of the episode you and I did on regular Fraud Boxer. So we decided to go a little deeper on a couple of things with Jacqueline. So I believe that you guys know each other. Am I correct in my assumption there?
You are.
we go way back. We go way back. I don't even know how long it's been, but when you were back at Glenbrook, which is what, 15 years ago?
Yeah, good 10 years ago. So yeah, it's good to see you.
Likewise.
So we had kind of talked about a couple of things specifically that we wanted to dive deeper in. Jacqueline and I have touched on a couple of things on the show already. Some of the episodes haven't come out yet of those things. But I think where we kind of wanted to start today was some of the stuff that's on the MAG and MRC topics boards a lot. It's a couple of things. These are going to be a little bit shorter episodes, everybody. They're not going to be a full 1 hour. There's going to be a couple of 20-minute ones where we're going to dive deeper. So network tokens, we've kind of talked about a little bit already, and we'll talk about that. But also debit routing. So I think, especially coming out of like the MAG conferences, there seems to be a lot of sessions specifically related to debit routing. What it is, how it works, and how people can take advantage of that. So I kind of wanted you guys to just talk a little bit about what it is, how merchants like myself, Jacqueline, you are a merchant as well, how we can benefit from that, and what companies like Pagos could do to help us take advantage of that from our acquiring partners. So if we could, Jacqueline, do you want to start with this?
Sure. I think, do you want to start with the network token topic? I think that's a good place to go directly.
Absolutely. Let's do it. So fire us off, and then I will do my best. I'm going to live learn, everybody. So anybody that's watching this can watch my facial expressions live learn. So here we go.
Well, so I think some of the questions that have sort of come to mind when it comes to network tokens is around how it really works within your overall ecosystem, and whether or not, because these services often come with charges, whether or not you know that the network token is actually going to work to, one, tokenize your credentials, all of them, to then turn around and actually get you a better acceptance rate, which is the promise, right? That a network token from Visa or MasterCard would actually have a better success rate with Visa or MasterCard issuers. And then the third sort of promise is that they update those tokens. And so the question is, does this really replace Account Updater or not? So I think as we go through all that, class, I understand your company has offerings in this space. I'm curious to know where you play, how you play in the network tokens, and we'll talk a little bit more about benefits to merchants and why they might do it.
Sure, absolutely. So I think there's two parts of the answer to that. One is we have an analytical tool that helps companies actually track performance. That goes pretty much into everything we do. I think a lot of things in payments, both from the merchant side and the vendor side, is a discussion without data. So people use words, hey, we're better because of some random comment that doesn't necessarily make sense practically. And then they don't back that up with data, and the merchant doesn't have the data or doesn't have them accountable. So we're trying to put numbers into the discussion between the two parties. So from a network tokens, as many other things, we help them identify, all right, if I did network tokens, what is the upside? And then if I am doing network tokens, am I actually successful? Because I think what you find for a lot of companies, especially bigger ones with complexity of their technical platform, they don't actually run on all the transactions that they could. Now, that could be because they are actually outsourced to their vendor, and their vendor basically running some basic logic that is not optimized for them. And they really should take control and say, hey, these are the 100 transactions that I need to run network tokens on. How come only 80 of them actually happen on network tokens? So those are the component. And then the second part of what we're helping them with, it turns out if you have network tokens and Account Updater across the different vendors that companies have for payment processing, you might find a situation that you have several vendors, one of them supports it, one of them don't, one of them have built it in a way that's very limiting for you. So at least a part of the market want to take control of the tools and say, the only way to really run this successfully and the way I want to do it, to execute, is for me to control how I do network tokens and account updater. So separate that component from the payment processing. So we built an API where you basically send us your PAN, your 16 digits on your credit and debit card. We will convert it into a token and a cryptogram if we're talking network tokens from Visa, American Express, MasterCard, and Discover. And then you can take that and process that on your existing infrastructure. That just gives you the ability to better control the outcome and do it in a consistent way in order to get the most optimal result possible. But you can also do it with your payment processor, assuming they support it, and we help you with the analytics of actually maximizing the outcome that comes with that, whether it's selling more, optimizing fraud rules, or getting the exchange that you are able to get from a reduction in a bunch of countries.
So if I actually want to see the token in my system, the network token, what's happening to the actual PAN? Do I have to see the PAN to do that?
You definitely need to keep the PAN.
Yeah.
So whatever the network's saying, that is not a ideal outcome. For now, the best way to keep the PAN. Why? Because there could be situations where network tokens isn't supported by the issuer, and the only way to get the transaction to then is go back to the PAN.
So I would still have a ton of PCI liability if I was doing it that way, though, right? Because then
You
I would
could,
still use.
yeah, you would definitely could design your system so it's a lot less than it was before, and that could make a huge difference in the scope of your PCI. So there's a big reduction that could be had. But if you value performance as in selling more, then yes, you do need to keep your plan.
Interesting. Real quick, because you guys both mentioned this a little bit. So let's take network tokenization as one thing and account updater as a separate thing.
Yep.
Now, network tokens, essentially, Jacqueline, I think you said it. There was a promise that the networks would be actually updating those tokens with the new credential on their side for us. So would that eliminate the need for account updater in theory? Like, or is it you still have to have that? I'm just curious. I'm learning right now.
I think there's, I can go first to reverse it, but I think there's two components of that. It's somewhat market dependence. Like in the US, you have a very high level of support on the issuer side for network tokens. So then the answer is not as much as in other countries. But even so, I think you're conflating a little bit of the use cases,
Okay.
because it could be I'm a subscription merchant, I have used account updater and I update the batch before I run it, as an example. But with real-time account updater, you could actually go and attempt to get the updated credentials at the moment of processing, which is a little bit more complicated with network tokens. So there are use cases if you want to make it the most optimal for your performance, where you actually do need to use both. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Okay, so that makes sense to me, because I would obviously, like, historically, when I've ever worked in any sort of subscription environment, that's what we do is we either check, or we know the expiration, we know to check. We check at that moment in time, or we do the batch. But that's historically what I've always done, because you never know whether, well, I guess you would now if you ask. But for me, historically, you're kind of getting a token, but usually it's more of an acquirer token or processor token versus a network token. It's like their own thing. So it's just always been, that's what you do, is you do the account updater at that moment, because I mean, I could never rely or expect to have a network token. I think it's kind of a more recent thing. I know it's supposed to be more recent. Like, it's more people are supposed to have adoption now, but it seems like people still don't. It seems like there's still so many questions. Am I using them? Am I not? Like, what is a network token? What is real? What isn't? That sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think for account updater in particular, the technology been around a long time. Yes, it's now possible to have more scenarios like mixing real time and batch. But I think many of the vendors have built those solutions very differently. So the functionality, there is no such thing as account updater being the same thing, or meaning the same thing, or functioning the same thing across a number of different payment processors. Therefore, people have very different perception of how it actually works as a function of how someone have built it on top of the network. So.
Yeah, no, that's very true. The different acquirer that you work with creates a very different scenario. And some of them are good at this, and some of them have not developed it to the same extent.
I want to pick up on a thing that Jacqueline said earlier in terms of, is there a benefit of using network tokens or not? I think that's, so for whatever reason, for many years now, it's been out. People have been using it. People have been publishing really great results that have material impact. I would argue C-level people at the company would pay attention to if they understood what it was, versus maybe only the payments team in the company. Yes, you will see a materially positive impact on your approval rates if you use network tokens correctly. And that could range in the 2 to 5 to 6%. So if you're doing 100 and you get several percentage points, that's a pretty
Mhm.
big number that you want to take advantage of. And obviously, these aren't just more transaction going through. These are actually more customers that are capable of buying from you that build a relationship with your brand for a long time. So yes, everyone should be doing network tokens, but it comes with complexity like everything in payments. So I
Right.
think
Yeah.
once you look at real data, you will see that this is something you should try. But there's a work involved in some cases as a function of that, like we talked about earlier. With you probably need to keep your PAN if you have enough transactions, as an example.
Excellent. Well, everybody, so talk to your acquiring partners about your network tokens. Find out if you're using them, if you can use them. If you're not getting the answers you like, just call Pagos and have them sort it out for you. That's probably easier actually to do because you guys have the connections to everybody already. So you could just pretty much tell anybody. So that was fun. Let's talk about debit routing, shall we? So,
Sure.
Jacqueline, let's kick us off on some debit routing if you could.
Sure. Yeah, I think people talk about this a lot about being this magical thing you can do, and the reality is it's very helpful to have the plan of debit routing. So here's what it means: on every card, there's a front of card brand, a Visa or a Mastercard on the front. These are my two best examples, right? And on the back, thank you to the Durbin Amendment, has to be a competing network. Those networks are local ATM networks across the country. They run under a variety of different brand names, but low cost debit routing is basically suggesting that you consider when you get a Visa card to route the transaction actually to the back of the card network, whatever that might be that they've put that's a competing network on the back. And in doing so, you tend to negotiate a strong rate with that brand, or look to get a better cost, right, for that transfer than you're getting off of the Visa branded transaction. Once you're into this space, though, you're generally into negotiating contracts and agreements with a variety of parties, not just accepting the rates that come from your acquirer, but also thinking about whether you can go straight to the networks with your volume and talking to the network for a direct rate as well. So, this is where rate negotiations in the debit world come to play. But a lot of acquirers do offer this as a service. So you can start with just asking your acquirer what they do about it. And then, class, I know that in order to do this, I, as a merchant, have to tell my acquirer where to route usually. Not every acquirer or processor knows how to route on my behalf or has a tool by which I can make choices as a merchant. But Pagos, I understand, can help me with those decisions. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's two parts of that. Again, the analytical side. So same thing here. I think to my surprise, actually, over the last couple of years, you would think this isn't as complicated for as many merchants as it actually is. There's two parts to that. One, they actually have a hard time figuring out what is the scope of how much of my transactions actually would be eligible for the debit routing, and therefore, what is the business case? And then second, they start actually doing it, and they have a hard time actually getting all the transactions that they should be able to have eligible for debit routing actually being routed from accordingly. And that could be, to your point, maybe they need to be in control of how to do that with their acquirer, and the acquirer doesn't help them, or it could be other factors on their technical platform. So we help them with those two steps to be on top of what is the business case and then optimize it once they're doing it. One way of being able to route the way you should route is having the correct bin data, and we help them with a service as well for that, so that they can get the most up-to-date bin list in the market that helps them be more precise in splitting out where should I send transactions. And there is a difference between the global networks and the debit networks. Therefore, we have built integrations to both for our bin data service, so that we get the data from the local debit networks, which gives you a more nuanced picture of what is actually eligible and which ones should you take advantage of. And
Yeah.
the upside is big. So there is a cost component to it that you're saving on interchange. There is in quite a few cases, higher approval rates. And I
Yeah.
think in some cases, people have even seen a little bit difference on chargebacks. But I think that probably depends on many more factors. So that's a little bit more blurry if that's true for everyone or not.
So this is how I have always pictured debit routing, guys, and tell me if I'm right or wrong. Now, there is that initial choice that if I use the bin data, and we'll talk about that on the next episode, we're going to go do a little deeper dive into bins specifically, 6 and 8 digits. So everybody stay tuned for that one. But how I see it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is people are putting their credit card in and we're seeing the bin data populate, and we could say, all right, pass it across Visa rails, pass it across MasterCard rails, depending on if it's one of those cards, or pass it across one of the debit networks, just like Polestar, those sorts of networks. And we could make that decision, hopefully, with our acquirer's help to route it specifically over that. But am I right or wrong on that so far?
So you started with the wrong type of card usually. Usually this is debit. Yeah,
Yeah,
low cost
but
debit routing.
so let's say I have, like right now, I have a Capital One debit card, and it's got the MasterCard logo on it. So I got my 5 at the beginning. I'm typing it in. I'm trying to buy this golf simulator. It historically, because it has a MasterCard, it would run across MasterCard rails, and the merchant would pay MasterCard interchange rates plus any markup fees, et cetera, right? Historically. But since the Durbin Amendment, there has to be the two, so that card also probably has a Pulse network on the back. It could, in theory, instead of routing across the MasterCard that's on the front, it could route across the Pulse or Star, or whatever the debit network is on the back, right?
Correct.
And those rates are cheaper, typically.
Yes,
Yeah.
so it depends on that second piece, right?
Perfect.
So it depends on your scale, and it depends on what who your acquirer processor is as to whether you actually can do this for cheaper. There are actually fees to do this from your processor usually. So
Yeah,
you just
that
have
makes
to watch.
sense.
You need to be able to pay for reporting around this. You need to be able to pay to do the service. So in the end, you need to watch who you're paying to whom and whether you're actually getting better rates or not as you low cost debit route. Because some of these smaller networks aren't just cheap. Yeah, they have reasonable, what they consider to be reasonable rate, same as interchange. And so they tend to, some of them are not that different. So you just need to check what you're getting. A regulated rate will be a regulated rate, most likely, yeah. So you're not going to
Yeah.
save on your regulated debit. It's really on your unregulated that you have to actually find out what are the various fees you're going to get charged and how much is your acquirer charging for the service of doing this or not. Yeah. And how much do you have to take on as the merchant to build out that logic? And how much is your acquirer processor doing for you? So I wish there was a simple answer of everyone does it
Yeah.
this way. Unfortunately, these are as various as the processors you work with.
I think we find that the people who are serious are actually doing it. The answer is it's a material saving. Then I think coming back to why do Pagos even exist, people justify themselves out of doing things without having data, and then we end up in discussions that you just represented. I think the people who are doing debit routing have a big break on in-change, and that's why they're doing it. Sure, there are complexity of who your vendors are and what are the price points, etc. But if you look at the hard numbers, there's some big numbers to be saved. Now, your vendor may not support it, so then you need to change vendor, and maybe that's unrealistic as a function of your
Yeah,
size and the
okay.
savings, but it could be quite material.
I remember years and years and years ago when I first started hearing about this debit thing, that it was primarily like low transaction value and low margin merchants that were really trying to find a way to get it, because like the juice was so worth the squeeze when you're shaving that much off on that low of a margin, that they were like really trying to get it. Now I know they were really trying to get that sort of thing, but I know that like since then there's like the more, and this is going to be the last question for this particular episode, everybody, but for the retry logic that people have now in some of the more technical savvy acquiring partners, processing partners, and even merchants themselves are able to use the debit network as kind of like a backup or in some sort of stack, that if there's a failure on the main first attempt, it doesn't tell me as a consumer that I have a failure because it's going back and trying on a different network. Can you guys kind of help me out understand that, or help the audience understand that a little bit on how that works?
I mean, I think that it's sort of like a technical layer. If you have one way of doing it or two ways, you're more likely to succeed if you have two ways. So I don't think it's necessarily unique to debit routing. It's just like, hey, I have redundant ways of processing for you. I don't think most processors out there have that. But if you have some pretty sophisticated solutions, and those are probably the ones you're thinking about, then in that case, yes, you will have an improvement that could be material if your volume is big enough.
Yeah, and I do think, Jordan, to this is where the merchant has some logic to build, and to
Mhm.
figure out where they're getting the data on which to build that logic. But a retry logic is something that's super important and often customized at the merchant level. What do you get when you get a decline all the way from the payment system? Your processor is usually just sending you the decline and throwing up their hands. Yeah. So as a merchant, then do you immediately process that back, or are you taking that decline and trying to process again? So there are a lot of things to be done in a retry logic, to make sure that it works from a processing point of view. But you're right, having a second network is always a good idea for redundancy and to try again. So,
Excellent. Well, thank you guys very much for helping clear some of these questions up that I had and going a little deeper on network tokens and on debit routing. I hope everybody got a little more information, a little more understanding by listening to this one. I want to thank you both for coming on the show and doing this real quick with us. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. I will put links out to Pagos again on this one. So if anybody wants to ask them questions or learn a little more about how they could possibly do the network tokens with them, they'll have access to that. So yeah, thank you guys.
welcome.
Always fun to be on.